when Captain Renault, is that right? Yeah, comes in and he's been gambling in the casino forever, and all of a sudden when he gets, whoa, we're gambling! I'm shocked to find out there's gambling going on here, and shuts down the casino. And Rick's is obviously a pretext for shutting it down. Correct? When someone is terminated for some reason that seems pretextual. And again, we'll establish on Tuesday in the case of reading what constitutes pretext, what doesn't constitute pretext, what evidence is needed. When someone's terminated, when you're shocked, oh, gambling is going on, so I'm shutting down the casino. That's fake. The real reason because the Germans told them to shut it down. But like the real reason Santillo was fired in the next case wasn't for just some minor offenses that had never been enforced. They were from the union activity, at least that was 4 to 5. Okay, you got it? Again, we'll go into bigger detail. Start next week on Right Line, and then read particular attention to the Bud manufacturing case, an excerpt of which is in the footnotes, about Walter Wiegand and the Duchess. That's one of my favorite cases. I'm going to just post these slides on the Well, thank you. Take care. Well, considering I got a fraction, it's fine. Bye. See you.
Yeah, so do not have no numbers. Yeah, feel better. No, I hope you get some rest. Have a good weekend.
You want me aware of that?
It might be useful.
It's not worth it working.
Who cares?
Who knows?
Yeah. Better to be healthy.
You're immune from that.
Thank you. I hadn't really thought that through, but I think once we kind of brought that up, it makes sense.
Well, honestly, I couldn't think of a situation where you go encourage slavery. You want to play the lawyer
Some of it, like book questions. For example, I was thinking of in Chattanooga. Or there'd be other ones. Maybe, I don't know.
This is turned on line.
Are people going to be sitting up here?
I don't know. I'm just leaving. I was teaching.
Question about one of the problems.
Yeah.
What is there a difference between like benefits of employment and conditions? Because it seemed to me we were talking about stuff that'd be more like benefits, but not like wages.
Benefits in a classical sense. I use it kind of generically.
Okay.
But in a classical sense, I mean, benefits refer to like salary, wages, health care.
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's
vacation.
the same sort of idea.
But in conditions of employment might mean the workplace as they're lighting on the plant floor.
Okay.
It's more today, which was more relevant back in the older days. But I think for our purposes, they're roughly the same.
Okay.
Here, I'll walk up with you.
Yeah, sure.
In a second.
I was thinking there would be a difference between like, wages and hours and then stuff like having daycare.
Well, see, that's where the line gets kind of fuzzy.
Right.
In terms of, what is really a core benefit? Wages and hours are equal. There's a lot of case law on that. I'm trying to think if we've read it or we'll read it later on. I think in bargaining, we talk topics of bargaining.
Okay.
And we'll go over it in detail. Like what are proper topics? They're called mandatory topics of bargaining. I'll give you a preview of the law.
Oh, yeah.
And mandatory topics of bargaining are things that are so essential.
I guess they get paid anyway. Yeah. So.
This is great. I would like to sit closer to you.
Be prepared. Yeah, I really like it. That's such heavy things. So it's like straight up my head. Also, this may be it's objectively.
You're here.
Sorry? I wanted to burrito, I apologize, they're out here now. Okay. Oh, okay.
So aren't you worried that there will be cheese?
Oh, yes. Extremely.
It's a burrito.
No, it's very low.
Are you gonna pick it out? Figure it out.
I'm gonna assess it with. Sure.
We're in a law school, so of course. Yes, they all they won't do it if it's
I'm a
if I
lawyer by
don't.
training, so
Oh.
I'm a recovering lawyer. So I'm used to it.
Don't say that in front of the
No, I'll
students.
be very
It's the
careful.
20th.
The 20th already.
I know, it's wild. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
I'm fine. Do you have a presentation that you
No,
Oh,
I'm just
then-
talking.
Then I'll just get rid of all of this then.
It's more of a discussion, I think.
Sure, that's what I thought, but of course this was probably from the previous class that was in here.
Yeah. What do we do? We sit or is talk? Stand up and talk?
Which would you prefer? Totally up to you.
Do you want to sit together? I don't know.
Oh yeah, I can sit here.
I'm pretty easy.
Yeah, why don't I join you? Then for Q&A it's easier.
Yeah, it is. Okay. Adam, I'm okay standing or sitting, but
Okay.
sitting is sometimes a little nice.
This is a bit of a
A little
blockage,
less
but
formal.
right, that's true. I'll introduce you from here just because of this blockage.
Oh, okay.
Here it all goes.
And the students, second, or
I
all
think it's a
over?
total combination, actually. Yeah, I definitely see a bunch from your clinic, but also some new faces.
Looks like it.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, that's different, I guess. It's this one. That was more, yeah. Unless you can do it from, here easily, I think. Oh, I don't know.
Oh,
It's
no, that's-
screwed in, yeah. Okay.
I'll just put it
Okay.
this way. Well, then it looks like we have a wall between us.
Will it go on the floor or?
Oh. Khmer Rouge.
don't want.
Okay, that's all right.
Okay.
I will leave earlier, but
Okay. And we also we have a photographer. We have a photographer. Just
Oh boy.
so.
I would have gotten a haircut or something.
Yeah, exactly.
This is stressful. This is a really stressful part. How to make me look good? It's difficult.
That's right.
Yeah, let's get rid of that.
I just feel like
We didn't issue argument to me.
oh, okay.
Okay.
so I'm actually really happy for them.
Hi everyone, we're going to get started. Thank you all so much for being here with us this afternoon. So this program this afternoon with David Tolbert is part of our Human Rights in Practice series, which we run throughout the semester, co-sponsored by the International Human Rights Clinic and the Center for International and Comparative Law. We also are grateful for our co-sponsors for this event, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Keenan Institute for Ethics, and two student organizations, the Human Rights Law Society and the International Law Society. We're very happy to have David Tolbert with us today to discuss current developments and challenges in the field of transitional justice. And he'll be sharing examples from his work, including his work in Colombia, from which he returned quite recently doing direct work there, as well as Tunisia and some other contexts as well. He'll share his insights into where the field of transitional justice is going, and particularly within the current political context. By way of introduction, David Tolbert is currently Ford Foundation Fellow and visiting scholar across the street here at the Sanford School of Policy. And he was formerly president of the International Center for Transitional Justice from 2010 to 2018. I was actually also working at ICTJ at the time. We overlapped for a little bit, but I was based in Nepal, so we didn't actually get to see each other face to face. New York. Exactly. Previously to that, David was also former UN Assistant Secretary General and served in a number of senior positions over a period of almost a decade, including at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, in a range of roles. He was also appointed by the UN Secretary General as Registrar of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and before that, as UN Assistant Secretary General and Special Expert to the UN Secretary General on the Khmer Rouge trials. He's also held a range of other positions, too numerous to go through at the moment, included in the bio on the website. So again, we're very happy and grateful to have you here, David, and I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. And if you don't mind, I'm going to sit because I'm just more comfortable doing it that way. And thank you for going through my bio and stopping and not making me feel ancient. Given my hair color, I feel a little ancient already. But it's great to be here, and it's great to walk across the street and be here with lawyers. I am by training a lawyer, and I spent much of my career in the law, including, as was mentioned, 9 years at the Yugoslavia Tribunal as deputy chief prosecutor and a number of other positions. But today my subject is really very much about the term or the field of transitional justice. And what I thought I would say a few words about what transitional justice is, because it may be a different concept for some of you. You may not be that familiar with it. And then I wanted to talk about something that I'm working on as an article that I want to publish a little bit later in the year on transitional justice in the 21st century, and it'll be published in the Oxford book of Handbook on Atrocity Crimes. So you'll get the first sort of version of this, and then after you tear it apart, then I can start to rethink it. I thought I would just frame this a little bit around a couple of things that I've read or seen recently. Many of you are familiar with Hannah Arendt, who had written extensively about the Holocaust and the crimes of the Nazis. And she made a statement which I think is one that we wrestle with a great deal in the whole field of transitional justice and international criminal justice. And she said, "We attempt to understand elements in present or recollected experience that simply surpass our powers of understanding. We attempt to classify as criminal a thing which, as we all feel, no such category was ever intended to cover. What meaning has the concept of murder when we are confronted with the mass production of corpses?" And this is an enormous question that we have to deal with, or many societies have to deal with. Over 40 countries have tried to address the deep injuries and the fractures in the society, trying to recover either from authoritarianism, where you have massive human rights abuses. I'll talk about South America briefly later, or where I worked extensively in the former Yugoslavia, where you had genocide, where you had massive crimes against humanity, rape camps, all kind of horrors. I was reminded again of this last week when I was in New York at a Council of Foreign Relations meeting, and we had the vice president of the Cambodia Rescue Party speaking, and she said something that I strongly agree with, but she talked about all the problems in Cambodia, and there are a myriad of problems. But she said ultimately it's related to the Khmer Rouge period and trying to address the Khmer Rouge period. Some of you are too young to remember the Khmer Rouge period, but somewhere between 25 and 40% of the population were killed, murdered, exterminated, whatever the term you want to use, in this vast system of human slavery. Just staggering numbers. But I think if we think about these massive violations, these massive crimes, I mean, it's clear that you can't bring all the perpetrators to a criminal justice process. In the Yugoslavia Tribunal, where I was a deputy chief prosecutor, we set kind of a record. We prosecuted 121 very senior officials and military leaders, and some who were lower down in rank. But there were more than 10,000 perpetrators in Bosnia alone. We're not counting Serbia, other countries. So what we see in transitional justice over a period of time, the concept of transitional justice, really tries to address this question of how do we restore civic trust? How do we restore civic trust both in your neighbors, but more particularly in the governing authorities in the society? How do we try to ensure that this does not happen again? How do we build a future that's based on the respect of human rights? And I think we would go back a bit in time. Germany is the first country that really wrestled with this, not immediately after the World War II period, but over, I think, 50 years have taken a lot of steps. I'm on the Nuremberg Academy advisory board, and I go to Germany a lot, and they've done many things. Obviously, the Nuremberg trials were international trials, but they held a lot of important national trials, in particular Frankfurt, the Auschwitz trials, which shed a great deal of light on what happened. But I think they're even more known for their extensive memorialization. If you just go to Berlin, it is a memorial in many ways to the victims of the Holocaust. They opened the archives, they've revised the curriculum, and I think ultimately when we think about transitional justice, we want to see the truth or the real story end up in the curriculum so that it's learned by the next generation. And many of you too young to remember this, but Willy Brandt's knee fall in the Warsaw Ghetto, where he went to his knees in front of a place with terrible atrocities. It was really kind of a form of apology and acknowledgement, which I think is essential to transitional justice. In the 1980s, we saw, I think, very important steps made in this kind of transitional justice paradigm in South America. Chile and Peru established truth commissions. Nunca Mas, which is now 30-some-odd years old. I came here 3 or 4 years ago to give a speech about Nunca Mas on the 30th anniversary of Nunca Mas, which told the story of what really happened in Argentina and actually changed the country deeply. Trials, you'll know about the Pinochet trial and other trials. But South America, I think, is a repository of a lot of transitional justice processes. I think probably, in my view, and this may be a little sacrosanct, but or iconoclastic, because my previous organization, International Center for Transitional Justice, came out very much of the South Africa experience. It's an important experience. There are a lot of important things that come out of South Africa. Some of it very, very good experiences, and some that you can learn on that are much more negative. But I think that if we think about the experience in transitional justice, I would focus a little bit more on South America than South Africa. South Africa, of course, had the controversial amnesty, where amnesty was offered for truthful testimony in the Truth Commission, quite controversial. We do see amnesties in a number of other range of other countries. Northern Ireland is a good example. Amnesties are more complicated today with the adoption of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The question of whether there's pretty strong arguments that you could not give an amnesty for, at least de jure, at least in terms of legal norms for crimes against humanity, genocide, or war crimes. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And I'll come to Colombia in a minute, where I'll talk about amnesties, which do not, I think, run afoul of the Rome Statute. And also, I would just say a few words that over time, there's been a much deeper focus on vulnerable groups, on women, on children, on an array of minorities, to ensure that their demands for justice are met. And I'll come back and talk a little bit how that happens in the consultation process. Child soldiers phenomena, I was privileged to address the Security Council a few years ago on the child soldier phenomena. And over time, and we'll talk about this in respect to Tunisia in particular, the inclusion of women and the participation of women in that process, including chairing the Truth and Dignity Commission, which is the key transitional justice measure in Tunisia, I think is very important. So sexual violence and violence against sexual minorities have become a much bigger focus. I would say that although governments and the UN oftentimes set up these processes, the transitional justice, at least in my understanding, and I think those who work in the field, is that it's really driven by civil society. The energy comes from civil society. Victims groups in particular, it's a great deal of victims. What is justice for the victim? Consulting with victims. Obviously religious groups, minorities, women, and even ordinary citizens, not just the elite. So I'll talk about Tunisia in more depth, but one of the important characteristics of the Tunisian process was consultations across society. It wasn't just in Tunis, it just wasn't with the elites. It wasn't just with those who spoke French, it was across the society as a whole. They went into the hinterlands, they listened to the witnesses, they listened to the victims, and then made decisions around what transitional justice measures were going to be put in place and adopted. And so the deeper that consultation, and that's something that we worked a great deal in ICTJ, the deeper that consultation with civil society, with victims, broadly across the country, the more likely I think the chances of having an impact and dealing with the past and having accountability. I will say, and I think this is a kind of mixed subject in the sense that we see more and more often that transitional justice measures are put into peace processes. So in a peace agreement, instead of going through a consultation process, I think I was talking about in Tunisia, we will see a truth commission, perhaps a specialized court. I think Kenya may be the best example. It had virtually everything. There was a truth commission. There was a specialized chamber, reparations, and other processes. It can be. It's a tricky question of whether that advances the ball or not. I think probably in some cases it does, but I think it's something that we have to, those who work in this field have to be very careful that you don't just take a cookie cutter approach or kind of check the box. We're going to put a truth commission and a set of reparations and a specialized chamber. It needs to be much more anchored to the society. And you might find interesting, you can find this on the ICTJ website. We did a big study with Kofi Annan Foundation, worked very closely with Kofi Annan. I'm very sad at his passing, but can truth commissions strengthen peace processes? And there are a lot of pros and cons about that. So I wanted to focus most of my time, and you'll keep me on time, right? I have a tendency to wander off, so, as you can already tell. I want to look a little bit more at the 21st century, or the century that we're in now. I mean, we're about a fifth through it. So we're not simply talking about the future, but I think the past is prologue. And I think it's very clear that there's an enormous amount of blowback against human rights, against transitional justice, against accountability, against the International Criminal Court. I'm sure some of you heard John Bolton's speech the other day. Not very well informed, but very vitriolic in its attack on the International Criminal Court. And we have seen some, and we began the century with a lot of hope, I think. And the Arab Spring, for example, which happened early in the century, and frankly, it did not live up to expectations. In fact, it went in the wrong direction from a kind of accountability or human rights point of view, whether you're in Yemen or Egypt, where authoritarians are in control and a lot of human rights abuses are occurring. There has been blowback in Africa. I've mentioned the conflict between Africa and the International Criminal Court. Obviously, what's going on in Myanmar, Burma is very, very troubling now. So the political dynamics are very important with respect to whether transitional justice, whether accountability is going to play the kind of role that we think it should. And the political dynamics in the country are obviously very important, and understanding the political dynamics and what is possible. What I thought I would do is, since I'm talking about the 21st century, talk about 2 or 3 specific examples, which I think you already forecast. I think the most interesting one is Colombia, which, as many of you know, has gone through a 50-year civil war between the FARC rebels and the government, and also other groups that have not been included in this peace process yet. The ELN has still not joined. There's not reached an agreement. So it's a 50-year civil war with well over 200,000 deaths. So obviously affected the country very, very deeply. President Santos came in after President Uribe. Uribe was seen as a very, very tough president and pursuing the rebels militarily, although there is a very interesting wrinkle there, and it's the peace and justice law, which I'll talk about in a moment. But under President Santos, a peace agreement was reached with the FARC, and within the peace agreement, a truth commission was established, and in fact, this report was launched in Colombia for that reason. Reintegration processes to try to reintegrate rebels and families, and particularly children who were kidnapped. There's huge numbers of children that were kidnapped, particularly by the rebels, and trying to reintegrate them, providing reparations, material recognition for the suffering that they've had, whether in the terms of vouchers or in terms of education. And then very interesting aspect is the criminal justice aspect. Under the earlier iteration, there was the peace and justice law where rebels in particular could come forward and confess and receive a reduced sentence. But the agreement then actually established something I think that's very innovative and interesting and controversial. So once the agreement with the FARC and the government was reached, this something called a judicial court called the Special Jurisdiction for Peace was established under the peace agreement. And this is what I was doing a month ago or so ago, discussing with judges how to do this. But let me give you a little bit of detail about how the Special Jurisdiction for Peace works. So there was an amnesty, but an amnesty in accordance with Protocol 2 of the Geneva Convention, so it's not in violation of international law. And that applied mostly to foot soldiers, mostly the FARC. Then the FARC leadership was adamant about not serving jail time. So this is one of the key issues. You have people who've committed horrendous crimes, thousands of victims. They're not going to come to the peace table or sign the agreement, and the war is going to go on if you don't reach some kind of deal. And so there was a great deal of back and forth on this, but the Special Jurisdiction for Peace provides that if you come forward and confess, essentially, it's a confessional system, tell the truth, and it's seen to be the truth, you are able to have a alternative sentence. Now, this is still being worked out, and this is something we were talking a lot about with the judges. And my discussion with the judges focused a bit more on how do you make the selection and of what priority, how do you prioritize and select the cases that you're going to take? Because there are over 200,000 crimes. Now, I'll give you an example. So when I was deputy prosecutor at the Yugoslavia Tribunal, we had 10,000 perpetrators in Bosnia alone. We would be in business for 600 years to do all of that. We tried 121. Nuremberg tried 22. Well, there were 3 major Nuremberg trials, but let's say 60. But 121 took us 15 years. It's still not over. These are complicated cases, enormous amounts of evidence, particularly when you're going to have senior leadership cases. You have to get insiders to turn on you. I can talk about this in more detail. But you're only going to, your ability to prosecute above the kind of senior level is not going to happen. The ICC has had much less activity than we had at the Yugoslavia Tribunal. And the registrar of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and when I met, and I had been a registrar myself, so we talked a great deal, he said that they will investigate about 1,000 out of 200,000 crimes. I think that gives you a sense of the proportion and why other transitional justice measures are so important. So we were talking with the judges very much about how you selected those cases and prioritize them. getting 200,000 down to 100 to 1,000. But the innovation is very much around the sentencing. So the community will be, and this is still a bit vague, but the community is going to be deeply engaged in determining what the sentence is. So there'll be community service probably, there will be rehabilitation of buildings destroyed and so forth. But that is one of the key issues because there is not going to be conventional jail time. One can argue about that. There have been many, many arguments about it, but a key factor is Colombia is under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and the prosecutor has essentially said, this is good enough for me. So there's not going to be an outside intervention. The prosecutor could have said, this doesn't meet international standards, and could have blown up the deal. I think it's a tough call, being a former prosecutor and former president of a transitional justice organization. I think she got it right. I do. I don't think there was much choice. But it's quite controversial. And the former president, Uribe, was deeply opposed to this, and the conservative or right-wing organizations and political parties in the country are very opposed. And they are now in power, so we will have to see what happens. I wanted to say a few words about, okay, on time, a few more minutes, okay. I want to talk a few minutes about Tunisia, because I think that's another very interesting country where transitional justice has played a major role. Obviously, if you think about the Arab Spring and what happened in the Arab Spring, for the most part, it's been a huge disappointment, I think, or at least from someone who's wants to see human rights expanded. I think there was a lot of hope when the Arab Spring occurred, but Egypt obviously went in a very different direction. We went to Egypt. We had a lot of conversations with them, but Egypt, obviously, with Sisi in power, is an authoritarian state. Yemen is the place of outright war. Libya, more or less the same. And really none of the other countries except Tunisia did we see a process that seemed to make, that made some significant progress and something that's worth talking about. And it's very interesting, they call it the Truth and Dignity Commission, whereas you usually hear of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the Truth Commission. And this word dignity seems to have a very strong cultural, if not religious, meaning, both in Tunisia and the Arab world more generally. Part of it plays into colonialism, I think, and part of it plays into kind of the oppression of society more generally. In any event, it was a very innovative commission. They had a women's subcommission, which was part of the Truth and Dignity Commission, and gave a lot of prominence to women. I met a number of times with the chair of the Women's Subcommission, and I think they brought women's voices in a society where that was not particularly common out. And they held some very moving public hearings, a bit like South Africa. One of the things of the South African Truth Commission was that it was publicly broadcast, and it was done in Tunisia as well. I was invited and spoke and sat on the front row, and it was a very moving experience to listen to the terrible crimes. And I think it seemed to have an impact not just in Tunisia, but resonated across the region. Unfortunately, I think things are not going particularly well in Tunisia. The Truth and Dignity Commission is wrapping up its work and some controversy. There's a law on reconciliation. It's called the Reconciliation Law. It has nothing to do with reconciliation. It has a lot to do with paying off business elites. So one has to be always careful of instrumentalizing terms or seeing that terms are instrumentalized for nefarious purposes. And there's a great deal of fatigue with the Truth and Dignity Commission. But I tend to see this as about 1.5 steps forward and 1 back in the situation. and Tunisia and the Middle East, particularly because I think of the role of women and the Truth and Dignity Commission and society as a whole. I wanted to reflect on two other things before I close. One is, I think as we think about transitional justice in the 21st century, there's a lot of tension between the North and the South. It's a really interesting, very long, and I didn't get through it before I gave this talk, but I read a good bit of it. The Berkeley Journal of International Law, you may have seen this, it talks about how power dynamics influence the North-South gap in transitional justice, and there's a long dialogue. Essentially, all the resources are in the North, in places like Duke and in places like, and Europe, obviously. And most of the experience and most of the countries going through transition, whether it's Tunisia, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa, is in the South. And there is a good bit of, and the money is in the North. So the Ford Foundation, the Swedes, SIDA, MacArthur Foundation, Open Society Foundation, Oak Foundation, Norway, the money and the resources all come from the North. And there is some tension around people like myself and some of you perhaps being involved in this, which I think our expertise is important, but not to crowd out the people from the South, because we're able to raise the money and we're able to, they feel, at least some people in the South feel like the show is dominated by Northerners. So I think that is a big issue that we face. And I did want to close with a few thoughts about the United States, since we're here in the United States. And there is a great deal of activism here at Duke, obviously, but across the United States. But we've obviously deeply failed on so many different fronts, whether we're talking about the race issue. I'm originally from North Carolina. I'm from the South. And the reason I got into this work was because I grew up in segregation, and I saw the effects of segregation and the effects of extreme racial discrimination. And while there has been some progress, there remains a deep open wound. Native Americans, obviously, women, a whole range of minorities. There are some very promising and interesting civil society developments. The Me Too movement, I think, is very important, and it's something actually that might be exported to some extent to other countries. Black Lives Matter has certainly been a very important issue or movement. And there have been some steps that I think have been good. We saw the mayor of New Orleans take down statues of Confederate soldiers or generals and slaveholders in New Orleans. We've had a limited number of truth commissions, but there was one in Greensboro. I remember those killings quite well back in the early 80s. There's been a truth commission in Maine about indigenous people. Obviously, we need criminal justice reform in a very serious way. But I think some lessons have been drawn from abroad. And we do have the Citizens Commission on Extraordinary Renditions here in North Carolina as well. Just to flag this for you, this has been an area of a lot of interest for me. And before I left ICTJ, I held a discussion with Darren Walker, who's the African-American president of the Ford Foundation, and with Sherilyn Ifill, who is the executive director of the NAACP Defense Fund, and written a terrific book that I think is well worth reading, On the Courthouse Lawn. She talks about lynchings in the eastern shore of Maryland. I thought they were mostly down further south, and how makes a number of really interesting proposals on how to address those issues and how to recognize the victims. And I'm hopeful that dialogue and others, and I can leave the link, or you can look it up. It's on the ICTJ website. And so those are some few thoughts. If you're really interested, I have an article coming out next year, the Oxford Handbook on Atrocity Crimes, called Transitional Justice in the 21st Century, with a Chilean lawyer and scholar who I've been working with, Marcela Rodolfi, and it should be out in 2019. So your feedback may get incorporated in my article. So with that, why don't I stop and we can talk about other things. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have plenty of time for questions. I'll open it up.
Yes, hi.
So I'm originally from Colombia, so it's very interesting. So I wanted to ask what you thought would happen now that Duque has been elected and Uribe is still in the Senate. If you think the fact that the ICC has chosen not to prosecute and that they thought the agreement was good enough, do you think that Duque would sort of like dismantle the whole thing, or do you think he'll keep?
Yeah, that's a great question. Should I take two or three?
Sure,
And then-
okay,
So
two.
there were there's some more, yeah.
There.
I have a similar question. On Wednesday, the New York Times published an article about how the possibility of thousands of FARC rebels rearming. I was just interested
Yeah,
in
I read that article, yeah.
on the transitional justice process.
One more?
Yeah, one more, since we had two in Colombia.
I was wondering if you could give any examples of how the women's involvement in the Tunisian process led to like concrete results, like was there law reform or greater representation or gender quotas? And I was also wondering if you could touch upon how transitional justice incorporates economic and social rights. So,
Yeah.
you know, you mentioned you wanted the truth in the books and education, how important or how much of an emphasis has been achieved in promoting education and health, food security, for example.
Yeah, 4 or 5 great questions. So might start with the last one and then work my way up, and you let me know if I skip something. I do that. So it's not because I don't want to answer it. I just get too wrapped up. This is really an important question, economic and social and cultural rights. And I think certainly transitional justice processes emerge much more on the kind of civil and political rights. There's no doubt about that. And I think most of the practitioners would probably plead guilty to that. I think there's some understandable reasons in the sense that getting at those issues can be much less difficult than getting at economic and social cultural issues, which can pull at some very deep issues in the society. I do think that there are tools or processes that transitional justice uses, particularly reparations, which I think address economic and to some extent social rights. If reparations are framed in a way where communities who have been marginalized benefit from those reparations. Now, reparations are awfully simply seen as monetary payments, but there are various reparations programs that can help address systemic problems in community, whether they're supporting education, and that can be education of marginalized communities, for example. So I do think reparations is an element of addressing pretty strong element. It's probably the strongest process that addresses economic and social rights. I do think truth commissions also can, and I should also say that criminal justice processes can also award reparations, so that happens in some societies. The problem with that tends to be it's based on the case, not on the community as a whole. So we at ICTJ and I would advocate for community-based reparations and assessing the community and where are the needs. Is it around education? Is education voucher an appropriate, the best response? Or is it about poverty? And do we need to try to push for vouchers for economic needs or welfare reform? But I still think it's rather limited. You know, it's the reparations, in my view, should move up the scale rather than just be simply an afterthought. And sometimes I think it is. So I think your point is well taken. There's of course this very interesting and important debate, I think, in human rights generally. Probably have seen Samuel Moyn's book, Human Rights Are Not Enough, and this whole debate. I wouldn't agree and be on board with the strongest statements that somehow another human rights is a foot soldier of neoliberalism and so forth. But what I would say is I think we all in the many in the human rights movement, and particularly the big human rights organizations, the NGOs, have not focused on economic and social and cultural rights in the way they should. And I think we face this rather odd situation. I'm talking really frankly here, and I reference this a little bit in this North-South divide, but we are chasing money or chasing resources from the wealthy, and this is where Moyn's point, I don't think this is Moyn's point, but this is my point, that chasing resources from the wealthy individuals and from foundations and so forth, without thinking through how our work could make those groups more uncomfortable. And I think we probably ought to do that in a much more effective way. So I'm sort of 60% or 50% on board with Moyn. I think that we ought to be pushing hard on economic and social and cultural rights, not simply political and political and social political rights. And I think accountability has to be connected to plunder and which happened to so many developing countries. Now, I think it's a really complicated and difficult set of issues, and politics is quite wrapped into it. But I think it's a great question, and ought to be the subject of another discussion that maybe we can have some other time. In terms of Tunisia and law reform and gender focus and so forth, I think that's a very good question too. What I saw, I think is important in Tunisia is that, at least with the Truth and Dignity Commission, I think perhaps more broadly, the discrimination faced by women who wore the veil or women who were religious came down to some extent. There was a strong push to let them have their voice in this process. The woman who was head of the Women's Commission was a woman who wore the veil, or maybe not the veil, but the hijab. So I think there were some important signals sent out by the Truth and Dignity Commission to women, and the participation of women was much greater than might be expected. In terms of long-term results, which I think probably you're really referencing, I think that's hard to judge. The process has started strong and gotten weaker over time. And in terms of the law, I think with the with the return of the right, or the return of more authoritarian-oriented forces, legal reform did not take off like we would want to, and I think that imperils the process. The political conditions are in Tunisia closing to some extent, but compared to the rest of the Middle East, where they're completely closed, I think with devoting resources and pushing for building on the Truth and Dignity Commission is important. On Colombia, two questions that I think are a bit intertwined, and I did read the New York Times article. The new president and the parties in power are not friends to the peace agreement. That's really quite clear. It's unclear to me how much they can unroll or destroy what's happened. They will do some of that. In one sense, it's possible that the ICC could act as more of a guarantor of some of the process. But I think it's too early to see because too early to tell because we often see strongmen and others come in and they take one step back, but maybe not all the way back. So this is where I think it's so important for civil society and for outside groups and for outside countries to keep the pressure on so that these processes don't get completely undermined and so that we don't end up starting from ground zero 20 years from now. Yeah, I did see as I said, I saw the article on the FARC rearming, but the way I read it is that parts of the FARC are rearming. I'm not sure, it's not clear to me that the FARC is rearming en masse. I think we see this in other countries where you see dissident groups of rebels who don't want to follow the peace agreement or don't agree with their leadership. I think we'll have to see how far that goes, but I'm not surprised. I expect those kind of up and downs after a peace process. After you've been living as a guerrilla for 40 years, it is very difficult to come back. And in some ways, that article made that point. My guess is that those will be in a minority, but it will depend probably on how the authorities handle the transition.
I'm going to take the liberty to insert myself and ask a question, if that's okay. So I wanted to go to your point about some of the examples you gave in the U.S.
Yes.
And also first to highlight, as you mentioned, this North Carolina Commission on the Inquiry of
Yes,
Torture.
right.
And some of you may be familiar with this, but this is a citizen-led commission that was set up in North Carolina that held hearings last fall and will be coming out with a report next Thursday looking at the role of North Carolina in the U.S. government's rendition, detention, and interrogation program. And this is something that the International Human Rights Clinic has been very involved in. So I wanted to highlight that point. And also to your point about the various issues in the U.S., racial segregation, women's issues, indigenous peoples, that these are really examples of sort of structural violence and discrimination, and that while often transitional justice mechanisms elsewhere do look at some of these issues as root causes that might instigate civil war, that this would be very different in the sense that these are structural issues, but that haven't necessarily led in recent years to active war. And I'm wondering about your sense of whether activists are open to potentially exploring transitional justice mechanisms to address some of these issues. I know there's been some movement around reparations, for example, but what your sense of that is?
My sense is it's very divided. And even within ICTJ, there are great divisions. My program director thought absolutely not. Others, my communications directors thought absolutely so. So they're very divided kind of feelings about it. My sense of it was that we had an obligation to discuss this, not to say. Not to pronounce that transitional justice processes are or are not applicable in the U.S., but they ought to be considered. And frankly, I would say that there's some things that I think that you can draw from international experiences that apply. Similar to the Torture Commission, and I think around memorialization, for example, we could do so much better in terms of both memorialization and handling bad memorials better. I think Germany provides a great deal of experience that can be really useful. Truth commissions, some of our staff and some people got a little excited and talked about a truth commission for the United States. That's simply not in the cards now, and I'm not sure it ever would be. But I do think that in cities and states, like in Greensboro or Maine, this could be really useful. And I had just a little bit more broadly. there's an interesting piece published by an African-American evangelical about truth commissions in a magazine. I can give it to you. And I wrote a response because, and just to be clear, I was raised as an evangelical, obviously a very lapsed, totally lapsed, completely 100%, 100% lapsed evangelical. But I understand what they're talking about. And he had been the Francis Schaeffer professor. And when I was 18, I spent 6 months learning from Francis Schaeffer. So, I mean, I was deeply dyed in. So I kind of understood where he was coming from. And actually, I thought it was a great piece. You know, I thought, here, he understands why we need to do transitional justice in a way that evangelicals that I knew and grew up with would never understand. So I was in New York last week, and we talked for about an hour or so. And I do think that one thing that this very polarized situation we live in now prevents us from reaching across and finding some allies. So, for example, he's an ally. I mean, we agree about, well, we wouldn't agree on religion, but we would agree about 85% on everything else. And he actually understood it very well. And I asked him why anyway, we had a really interesting discussion. So I think you have to look at and examine it and see where the overlap is. And I think local truth commissions, yes, I would say. Are we going to have reparations for slavery anytime soon? I don't, that's not going to happen. Should that happen? Yes, in my view, but I think being politically smart and seeing and understanding which elements we can draw on and kind of avoiding America first and we're different. Well, we are. Every country's different, but there are things to be learned from. And I think we ought to be a lot more open to that than we are, because what we're doing here in the United States right now is not working, and that's really clear. So,
Matthew and then Jane.
I was wondering if you could talk at all about transitional justice and sort of imperfect peace processes, which I think would apply to Colombia in that paramilitary groups have played such a strong role, often like state-sanctioned paramilitary groups in the history of the conflict. But there isn't, a truth commission for the paramilitary groups, and there's not going to be, come forward and confess to, thugs employed by Uribe. And so I'm interested, now that there's, given this New York Times article, that a lot of the backfall is paramilitary groups reigniting conflict with FARC or sort of seizing on the peace processes as an arm. I'm worried about the idea that transitional justice here is a little more winner's justice for the government being repackaged, and whether you could talk a little about that.
Good question.
I'm going to go a bit away from Colombia and ask if you could talk through a bit the criteria for determining what crimes should be prosecuted. And if you've seen a shift in that criteria from the time at STY and forward.
Great question. Yeah. Let me start with that. The other one's awfully difficult, so they're both difficult. But I certainly have. There's a phone here. Somebody. Hello. Oh, it's for you, right? I saw it at the ICTY, and I think we see a much greater understanding as we move into the ICC and so forth of certain crimes, gender crimes, for example. I think it's probably the best and clearest example. When we started in 93 or 95, there wasn't much focus, but that changed over time. That changed because of advocacy, mostly by women's groups and governments too. I think of the Nordics and so forth. So I think that has changed pretty substantially. I think with the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the issue of children in conflict, major shift, the child soldier phenomenon, and the beginning to understand how complex all of this was. So I would say yes. I think also there's another aspect. Those are, I call maybe signature crimes or terrible crimes that maybe don't have the numbers. Because I think in the beginning at the ICTY, we were first opportunistic. You know, we got Tadic, we prosecuted Tadic. We got some Bosnians, we prosecuted them. But over time, as cooperation increased, then we began to really focus on the numbers and the types of crime. One of the challenges when you're trying to figure this out is if in the former Yugoslavia, you could spend every bit of your resources on Srebrenica because it's the massive signature crime. But if you do that, then you're going to miss so much more. And then the other major issue, and the ICC faces this in a different way, but we had crimes in 5, 6, 7 different countries. And obviously, Srebrenica and what happened in Bosnia was, in terms of numbers and in terms of seriousness of the atrocities. But people were killed in Montenegro and murdered, and women were raped, and Macedonia, and there was a terrible conflict in Kosovo. So developing criteria which tries to balance some of that. When you look at your resources and you look at the crimes and you look at the very vague direction you get from the Security Council or the ICC statute, is at least as much art as it is science. And I think you have to be also attuned to some of the currents of thinking. So you need to be connected to the academic community to some extent. I think maybe perhaps even more importantly, civil society, and what are the trends. I find that it's a really difficult set of issues, but I think it has changed. At the ICC has so limited number of prosecutions. It's a little hard, and it's much more opportunistic, I guess. And its jurisprudence is so all over the place, and the Bemba decision. What do you do with that? So, I think that's a bit confusing. At the Bosnia State Court, which I didn't work there, but I was deputy prosecutor and did a lot of the transfer cases. I think they had very clear criteria. They applied it. They kind of learned from our mistakes, and so I think that's really important. And what was interesting to discuss with the Colombian is, what does prioritization really mean? What does selection really mean? And I thought I knew what it meant, but then I had to give a presentation. I started, and of course, it's been 10 years ago since I was deputy prosecutor, and did some reading on that, and it means something a bit different in Colombia than it probably meant in the ICTY. So yeah, I think that the criteria has shifted. I think it probably should. And I think, within certain norms, it needs to be adjusted to the national context. That's kind of my view. This tough question on the Colombian peace process. Yeah, I think there was always a worry that if you watered down criminal justice in Colombia and you allowed this kind of confessional system, you would have war criminals, people who committed terrible crimes, sort of back on the street. You always have that. I mean, Rwanda, it was particularly bad because ultimately almost half, or probably 60% of the males in the country had participated in atrocities. So I don't think there's any easy answer to this. you certainly make, in transitional justice processes, you make compromises, and part of that is political, part of that is judicial, part of that is policy. And it may be that, I have no doubt that, and the New York Times article verifies that some of the guerrillas will go back to being guerrillas because they know no other life. On the other hand, I think it's way too early to judge, and what my hope would be is that all of these processes working together would change society, and not just in Bogota, but it would change it in the Northwest with the Afro-Caribbeans, that there would be a bit of a transformation over time. So I think it's entirely too early. People heralded the South African process as one that was great and perfect, and it turned out not to be so great and not so perfect. But I think if you look at some of the Latin American countries, which are deeply criticized at the time, they've had a very important impact over time. So I would say that often it's too early to judge, although there are troubling signs, and I'm not surprised in Colombia. This is anytime you're trying to end a 50-year conflict with this number of victims and these number of perpetrators, gigantic numbers of perpetrators, it is not going to be necessarily a clear road. But I think we have to make the judgment on the longer term, and politicians and those working in the field need to be monitoring this carefully to make adjustments as they go along.
Well, thank you. We are at time. Thank you all again for coming, and thank you.
Good. Great. Is that what you're...